There are moments in life that reveal the true value of a human being, not the moments filled with applause, not the moments surrounded by celebration, not the moments when success makes everything look beautiful. The truth usually appears somewhere much quieter: a hospital room, a lonely apartment, a missed phone call, an unanswered message, a chair beside a bed that remains empty day after day. And for Dorothy Elaine Hargrove, the truth arrived during 41 long days that would completely change the legacy she left behind. She lay in that hospital bed for 41 days, and not once did her phone ring. Not once did a door open and a familiar face appear in the frame. The woman who had spent 63 years giving everything to everyone she loved was completely, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her name was Dorothy Elaine Hargrove, and she had a son she had fed, clothed, schooled, nursed, cheered for, and sacrificed for. A son who, at the moment his mother needed him most, could not be bothered to come. But here is what that son did not know. He did not know that a young nurse named Clara Simmons worked the night shift on Ward 6. He did not know that Clara held his mother's hand at 2 in the morning when the pain was bad. He did not know that Clara brought extra pudding, read Bible verses aloud, and stayed past her shift. And he absolutely did not know what Dorothy had quietly decided to do about it. By the time he found out, it was already done, and nothing in his carefully arranged life would ever be the same again. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Dorothy ended up alone in that hospital room, we have to go back more than 40 years. Back to a small town where everybody knew everybody. Back to a little girl who grew up believing that family was the most important thing in the world. Dorothy was born into a working-class household. Her father drove delivery trucks. Her mother worked part-time at a diner. Money was always limited. Luxury did not exist. Every dollar had a purpose before it even arrived. But despite the financial struggles, Dorothy's childhood was filled with something many wealthy families never experience: love. Her parents were far from perfect. They argued. They worried. They struggled. But they showed up for each other every single time. When Dorothy was sick, her mother sat beside her bed all night. When her father worked extra hours, he still found time to attend school events. Those small acts became the foundation of Dorothy's understanding of family. Family meant sacrifice. Family meant loyalty. Family meant being present. Those lessons followed her into adulthood. At 19 years old, Dorothy met a charming young mechanic named Robert Hargrove. Robert had an easy smile, the kind of smile that made people trust him instantly. He was funny, confident, ambitious, and Dorothy fell in love faster than she ever expected. Within 2 years, they were married. Within 3 years, they were expecting a child. Dorothy believed her future had finally arrived. The home, the husband, the baby, the family she had always dreamed about. But dreams have a way of changing shape, especially when life begins testing them. When Michael was only 3 years old, Robert walked away. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument, no warning. One ordinary morning he left for work, and he never came back. A note arrived several days later, short, cold, final. He was leaving, he wasn't happy, he wanted something different. That was it, just a few sentences. A marriage reduced to a handful of words. Dorothy read that note dozens of times, then hundreds, searching for answers that weren't there, trying to understand how a person could simply disappear from the life they built. But eventually she stopped looking for answers, because she had a child to raise. And children do not pause their needs while adults recover from heartbreak. From that day forward, Michael became Dorothy's entire world. Every decision she made revolved around him. Every sacrifice had his name attached to it. Every dream she postponed was done for his future. While other parents rested after work, Dorothy picked up additional shifts. While other people enjoyed weekends, Dorothy cleaned offices. While friends took vacations, Dorothy worked holidays, year after year, month after month, without complaint, without recognition, without expecting anything in return. The strange thing about sacrifice is that it often becomes invisible. People see the result. They rarely see the cost. Michael saw a mother who somehow managed to provide everything he needed. What he never saw were the nights she cried alone after paying bills, the meals she skipped, the exhaustion she carried, the opportunities she declined, because Dorothy made sure he never saw any of it. She wanted him focused on possibilities, not struggles, and for many years her efforts appeared successful. Michael excelled in school. Teachers praised him. Coaches admired him. Neighbors talked about his potential. Dorothy attended every baseball game she could, every school performance, every graduation ceremony. If Michael was participating, Dorothy was present. No matter how tired she felt, no matter how busy life became, no matter what sacrifices were required. There was one moment that perfectly captured the relationship between mother and son. Michael was 14 years old. His baseball team reached the state championship. The game was scheduled on the same day. Dorothy was assigned an important shift. Missing work meant losing money she desperately needed, but attending the game meant everything to Michael. So Dorothy made her choice. She called her supervisor, accepted the consequences, and spent the afternoon sitting in the bleachers. Michael hit the winning run. The crowd erupted. His teammates celebrated. Parents cheered. And among all those voices, the loudest belonged to Dorothy. Years later, Michael barely remembered the game. Dorothy never forgot it, because mothers remember moments their children eventually leave behind. That is one of the hidden truths of parenthood. Children move forward. Parents carry the memories forever. As Michael entered adulthood, Dorothy felt proud. More proud than she could put into words. College acceptance letters arrived. Scholarships covered some expenses. Dorothy covered the rest, sometimes by borrowing money, sometimes by working extra jobs, sometimes by quietly sacrificing things she needed. Michael never asked how she managed it, and Dorothy never told him. She preferred it that way. By the time Michael graduated college, he had become everything she hoped he would be. Smart, successful, driven, focused. He secured a position at a growing financial consulting firm. His salary increased quickly. Promotions followed. New opportunities appeared. And for a while, he remained close to his mother. They spoke regularly, visited often, shared holidays together. But success can sometimes create distance without anyone noticing. At first, the changes were small: a postponed dinner, a missed weekend visit, a forgotten birthday call that arrived a day late. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just tiny cracks appearing in a relationship that once seemed unbreakable. Dorothy noticed. Of course she noticed. Mothers always notice. But she said nothing. She told herself Michael was building a life, creating a future, chasing opportunities, and she did not want to become an obstacle. So she remained supportive, patient, understanding. Even when disappointment quietly accumulated, years passed, the visits became less frequent, the conversations became shorter, the excuses became easier. Work was demanding. Travel schedules were complicated. Responsibilities were growing. Life was busy, always busy. Eventually, Michael married. His wife, Jennifer, was intelligent and ambitious. Like Michael, she valued achievement, goals, progress, success. She was polite to Dorothy, respectful even, but there was always a subtle distance. A feeling that Dorothy belonged to a chapter of Michael's life they had already outgrown. As time moved forward, that distance expanded. Calls became monthly, then occasional, then unpredictable. Sometimes weeks passed without contact. Dorothy continued making excuses. He is busy. He has responsibilities. He means well. She repeated those explanations so often, she almost convinced herself they were true. Almost. Because deep down, she knew something was changing. Something she did not want to admit. The little boy who once ran into her arms after school was slowly becoming a stranger. And the realization broke her heart more than she allowed anyone to see. Years later, when Dorothy was 63, winter arrived earlier than expected. The sidewalks froze, the temperatures dropped, and one ordinary afternoon changed everything. Dorothy was returning home from the grocery store. Her arms carried several bags. Her mind was focused on dinner. Then her foot slipped. The fall happened quickly. A sharp impact, a burst of pain, a frightened neighbor calling emergency services, an ambulance rushing through icy streets. What seemed like a routine accident revealed something far more serious. Doctors discovered an underlying medical condition that had been silently progressing for years. The prognosis was uncertain. Treatment would be difficult. Hospitalization became necessary. Days turned into weeks, and that was where the real story began. Because illness has a strange way of exposing relationships. People often promise they will always be there. Difficult circumstances reveal whether they meant it. Dorothy expected Michael to come, not immediately, not every day. But eventually, surely eventually, after all, she was his mother, the woman who dedicated her entire life to him, the woman who never missed a single important moment, the woman who spent decades showing up. Surely he would show up too. But the first day passed, then the second, then the third, and the chair beside Dorothy's bed remained empty. The first few days were the hardest, not because of the pain, not because of the treatments, not because of the uncertainty surrounding Dorothy's condition. Those things were difficult, but they were not what kept her awake at night. What kept her awake was hope. Hope can be a beautiful thing, but hope can also become a source of heartbreak when it lingers too long. Every morning, Dorothy woke up believing that today would be different. Today, Michael would come. Today, the elevator doors would open. Today, she would hear his voice in the hallway. Today, she would finally see her son. The first week passed that way. One hopeful morning after another. One disappointing evening after another. The nurses noticed. Hospital staff notice more than people realize. They notice which patients receive flowers. They notice which rooms stay busy with visitors. They notice who receives phone calls. And they notice who spends long hours staring toward the door. Dorothy rarely complained. In fact, she almost never mentioned her loneliness. Whenever a nurse asked whether family would be visiting, she smiled politely. "My son is very busy." It became her standard answer. "He works hard." Another familiar response. "He'll come when he can." That one became her favorite, not because she believed it, but because saying it aloud made it easier to endure. The truth sounded far more painful. The truth sounded like abandonment, and Dorothy wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. During the second week, several nurses attempted to contact Michael directly. Hospital policy encouraged communication with family members whenever possible. Messages were left, voicemails were sent, updates were provided. Eventually, Michael returned one of the calls. The nurse who spoke with him later described the conversation as polite but strangely detached. He thanked the staff, asked about Dorothy's condition, promised to visit soon, then ended the call. The promised visit never happened. 3 days later, another call was placed. Another promise was made. Another visit failed to occur. The pattern repeated itself, again and again and again. Each time Michael sounded concerned. Each time he expressed good intentions. Each time something prevented him from showing up. A business meeting, a client presentation, a work trip, an unexpected obligation. There was always a reason, always an explanation, always a justification. And slowly, the hospital staff began forming opinions. Opinions they rarely discussed openly, but opinions nevertheless, because words are easy. Presence requires effort. Meanwhile, Dorothy continued waiting. One afternoon, she asked a nurse what day it was. When the answer came, she seemed surprised. For a moment, she stared at the window. Then she quietly said something that lingered in the nurse's mind for years. "I didn't realize it had been that long." The statement sounded simple, but everyone understood what she meant. She wasn't talking about her hospital stay. She was talking about her son, about the days, the weeks, the silence, and how quickly hope was turning into disappointment. It was around that time that Clara Simmons first became involved in Dorothy's care. Clara had been working at the hospital for nearly 6 years. Most patients remembered her for one reason. She listened, truly listened, not the way people often pretend to listen while waiting for their turn to speak. Clara paid attention. She remembered details. She remembered stories. She remembered things patients said weeks earlier, and because of that, people trusted her. The first time Clara entered Dorothy's room, she immediately sensed something unusual. Dorothy smiled. She was polite, friendly, grateful. Yet beneath that kindness sat a sadness that seemed impossible to ignore. Clara recognized it because she had seen it before. Not often, but enough times. It was the sadness of someone waiting for love that never arrived. At first, their interactions remained professional. Medication schedules, routine questions, health updates, normal conversations. But over time, those conversations grew longer. One night, Clara found Dorothy staring out the window long after visiting hours had ended. The city lights glowed in the distance. Cars moved through the streets below. Life continued beyond the hospital walls.
You can't sleep?
Clara asked. Dorothy smiled faintly. A lot on my mind. Clara nodded. That answer was common among patients. But something about Dorothy's expression suggested there was more. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Dorothy broke the silence. Do you have children? The question surprised Clara. No. Dorothy nodded slowly. You'd be a good mother. Clara laughed softly. I don't know about that. I do. The response came instantly, without hesitation, without uncertainty. And for reasons Clara couldn't fully explain, the conversation stayed with her long after her shift ended. Over the following days, their friendship deepened. Not dramatically, not suddenly. The way most genuine friendships develop, one conversation at a time, one shared moment at a time. Dorothy spoke about her childhood, about growing up with very little money, about her parents, about family dinners, about memories she cherished. Eventually, she spoke about Michael. At first, the stories were joyful. His first bicycle, his first baseball glove, his graduation day, the pride she felt watching him succeed. Her eyes always brightened when discussing those moments. Even now, even after weeks of silence, she still spoke about him with love. But occasionally another emotion surfaced. Regret, confusion, heartbreak. One evening, Clara asked a simple question. When was the last time you saw him? The room became quiet. Dorothy looked toward the ceiling, as though calculating the answer. Then she sighed. 8 months. Clara felt her stomach tighten. 8 months, not 8 days, not 8 weeks, 8 months. And now there had been more than 2 weeks of hospitalization on top of that. Yet Dorothy quickly defended him. He has a demanding career. The familiar explanation returned. He works very hard. Clara wanted to respond, wanted to challenge the excuse, wanted to ask how any job could justify abandoning a mother. But she remained silent, because Dorothy wasn't looking for judgment. She was looking for understanding. As the 3rd week approached, Clara began spending additional time in Dorothy's room. Sometimes only a few minutes. Sometimes longer. They discussed books, movies, life experiences, faith, loss, hope. The conversations became something both women looked forward to. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Clara became the closest thing Dorothy had to family inside that hospital. Meanwhile, Michael remained absent. Far beyond the hospital walls, his life continued uninterrupted. His days remained filled with meetings, deadlines, conference calls, business dinners, professional ambitions. On the surface, everything appeared successful, impressive even. He lived in a beautiful home, drove expensive vehicles, wore tailored suits, maintained a carefully organized life. But there was one thing Michael had mastered over the years: avoidance. It had started gradually, a postponed visit here, a delayed phone call there. Each small act seemed insignificant at the time, until eventually avoidance became habit, and habit became distance. Then distance became neglect. The transformation happened so slowly that Michael barely noticed it. People rarely recognize their failures while they're happening, especially when those failures can be justified with convenient excuses. One evening, Jennifer finally addressed the situation. You should probably go see your mother. Michael looked up from his laptop. I will. You keep saying that. I've been busy. Jennifer paused, then asked a question he didn't expect. What if something happens before you get there? For a moment, Michael said nothing. Then he returned his attention to the screen. The conversation ended, but the question lingered. What if something happens before you get there? Back at the hospital, Dorothy received difficult news regarding her condition. The treatments were helping, but not enough. Recovery remained uncertain. Future complications were possible. The doctors were honest, compassionate, professional. Yet Dorothy understood what they weren't saying directly. Time was becoming increasingly valuable. That night, Clara found her unusually quiet. The cheerful conversations were absent. The smiles were weaker. The energy was different. After several minutes, Dorothy finally spoke. Do you ever think about how people remember us? Clara considered the question carefully. Sometimes. Dorothy nodded. I used to think people remembered what you gave them. She paused, then continued. Now I think they remember whether you made them feel loved. The words settled heavily between them, because both women knew exactly who Dorothy was thinking about, and exactly who she wasn't mentioning. Later that night, after Clara's shift officially ended, she remained beside Dorothy's bed for nearly an hour. No medical reason required it. No supervisor instructed it. She simply stayed. Sometimes presence itself becomes an act of compassion, and for Dorothy, that compassion meant more than Clara realized. Days continued passing. The calendar moved forward. The empty chair beside Dorothy's bed remained empty. But something else was beginning to change. The disappointment that once consumed Dorothy was slowly being replaced by clarity. Painful clarity. Unavoidable clarity. The kind that arrives after repeated heartbreak. The kind that forces people to see reality exactly as it is, rather than as they wish it would be. For the first time, Dorothy stopped asking whether Michael had called. Stopped asking whether messages had been returned. Stopped asking whether anyone had heard from him. The waiting was ending, not because her son had arrived, but because she was beginning to understand he wasn't coming. And once that realization settled into her heart, another thought began quietly taking shape. A thought that would eventually lead her to make a decision nobody saw coming. Not the doctors, not the nurses, not Michael, not even Clara. A decision that would alter several lives forever. And while the hospital corridors remained quiet, Dorothy had already begun considering exactly what she wanted her final chapter to say. Because after a lifetime of giving everything away, she was finally asking herself one question. Who had truly been there when it mattered most? The answer was becoming impossible to ignore. By the beginning of the fourth week, something inside Dorothy had changed. Not her kindness, not her generosity, not the warmth that had defined her entire life. Those things remained, but the waiting was over. For nearly a month, she had stared at doorways, listened for footsteps, invented explanations, protected her son's image from reality. Now reality was standing directly in front of her, and for the first time, Dorothy stopped running from it. The strange thing about acceptance is that it often arrives quietly. There is no dramatic announcement, no sudden revelation. One day a person simply understands. The truth becomes impossible to avoid. And once Dorothy accepted that Michael was choosing not to come, she began seeing her life differently. She spent long hours reflecting, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with honesty. She thought about the countless sacrifices she had made, the birthdays she worked through, the dreams she postponed, the opportunities she abandoned, the years she spent putting someone else first. And she asked herself a question she had never considered before. Had she taught Michael the wrong lesson? For decades, she had given without limits, given without conditions, given without expecting accountability. Perhaps somewhere along the way, Michael had stopped viewing those sacrifices as gifts. Perhaps he had started viewing them as guarantees, as obligations, as things that would always exist no matter how little effort he contributed. The realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. One evening, Clara found Dorothy staring at an old photograph. The edges were worn, the colors slightly faded. A young Michael stood beside his mother, holding a baseball trophy. Both were smiling. Both looked happy. "That's my favorite picture of him," Dorothy said. Clara pulled up a chair. "He looks proud." "He was." Dorothy smiled. "I was too." For several moments they sat quietly. Then Dorothy surprised her. "You know what I miss most?" "What?" "The conversations." Clara expected a different answer. Not visits, not holidays, not family gatherings. Conversations. "The older you get," Dorothy continued, "the more you realize people stop asking how you're doing." Clara listened. "They ask what you've done, what you've achieved, what you've accomplished." Dorothy's eyes drifted toward the window. "But very few people ask how your heart is doing." Those words stayed with Clara long after the conversation ended, because she realized Dorothy wasn't talking about strangers. She was talking about her son. Several days later, Clara arrived with a small notebook. At first, Dorothy seemed confused. "What is this? A project?" Dorothy laughed. "I'm too old for projects." "No, you're not." Clara handed her the notebook. Inside the front cover, she had written 3 words. "Your story matters." Dorothy stared at the page, then looked up. "What am I supposed to do with it? Write? Write what?" "Anything." Dorothy smiled. "Nobody wants to read my story." Clara shook her head. "I do." The notebook changed everything. Over the next several days, Dorothy began filling its pages. Memories, lessons, regrets, moments. Stories from childhood, stories about motherhood, stories about life. The more she wrote, the more alive she seemed, as though she was reclaiming pieces of herself that had been buried beneath decades of sacrifice. Meanwhile, Michael remained absent. But something was beginning to happen outside the hospital, something he couldn't see. People were talking, neighbors talked, former co-workers talked, church members talked. The story spread quietly through the community. An elderly woman had spent nearly a month in the hospital. Her son hadn't visited once. No one exaggerated. No one added details. The truth alone was powerful enough. And with every conversation, Michael's reputation began changing. Not publicly, not dramatically, but gradually. The way trust disappears. One small piece at a time. By the fifth week, Dorothy had become something unexpected on Ward 6. An inspiration. Patients asked about her. Nurses checked on her. Staff members stopped by simply to say hello. Her room felt different from the others, warmer somehow. Full of stories, full of laughter, full of life despite the circumstances. Much of that transformation was because of Clara. But Clara never took credit. She simply continued showing up, day after day, night after night, without realizing she was becoming the most important person in Dorothy's final chapter. Then came a conversation neither of them would ever forget. It happened shortly after midnight. Rain tapped softly against the hospital windows. Most patients were asleep. The hallways were unusually quiet. Dorothy looked toward Clara. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. If you knew your time was limited, what would you do differently?" Clara thought carefully, then answered honestly. "I'd spend it with people who wanted to spend it with me." The words landed heavily. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Then Dorothy nodded, as though confirming something she had already been considering. Something she had already decided. 3 days later, Dorothy requested a meeting with an attorney. Hospital staff assumed she wanted assistance updating paperwork. That happened frequently. No one thought much about it. But Dorothy knew exactly why she was making the request. For the first time in her life, she was making a decision entirely for herself. The attorney arrived on a Thursday afternoon. His name was Daniel Foster, a patient, thoughtful man with decades of experience handling estate matters. He expected a routine consultation. Instead, he found a woman who had spent weeks reflecting on her life and who knew precisely what she wanted. They spoke privately for nearly 2 hours. When the meeting ended, Daniel appeared unusually emotional. Years later, he would describe Dorothy as one of the most thoughtful clients he had ever encountered. Not because of what she chose, but because of why she chose it. Her decisions weren't driven by revenge. They weren't driven by anger. They weren't motivated by punishment. They were motivated by recognition. Recognition of who had been present. Recognition of who had cared. Recognition of who had shown compassion when it mattered most. Several legal documents were prepared. Witnesses were arranged. Everything was completed properly, carefully, legally. And once the paperwork was finalized, Dorothy seemed lighter, as though a burden had been removed. For the first time in weeks, she slept peacefully. Meanwhile, Michael finally attempted to call. The timing could not have been more ironic. After weeks of silence, he suddenly found a free moment in his schedule. A nurse handed Dorothy the phone. She stared at it. The room became silent. Clara happened to be present. Neither woman moved. Eventually, Dorothy accepted the call. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. Michael apologized, explained how busy things had been, promised to visit soon, promised he cared, promised he had been thinking about her constantly. Dorothy listened quietly. Then she said something simple, something that Michael would remember for the rest of his life. Thinking about someone and showing up for someone are not the same thing. Silence followed, a long silence. Then the call ended. No argument, no accusation, no anger, just truth, pure truth. And sometimes truth hurts more than shouting ever could. That night, Dorothy appeared peaceful. Not happy, not sad, peaceful. The waiting was over. The uncertainty was over. The disappointment was over. Because expectations had finally been replaced by acceptance. During the final days of her life, Dorothy spent much of her time talking with Clara. They discussed faith, purpose, family, forgiveness. One evening, Clara asked whether she hated Michael. Dorothy looked genuinely surprised. No. The answer came instantly. No mother stops loving her child. Even after all this, Dorothy smiled sadly. Love and disappointment can live in the same heart. The statement revealed everything. Dorothy wasn't motivated by bitterness. She still loved her son. She always would. But love no longer blinded her to reality. And reality had finally become impossible to ignore. The morning Dorothy passed away began quietly. Sunlight filtered through the hospital window. The sky was clear. The atmosphere felt strangely calm. Several nurses later described the day as peaceful, as though Dorothy herself had somehow accepted what was coming. Clara arrived shortly before sunrise. She immediately sensed something was different. Dorothy looked tired, but she also looked comfortable, at ease. The two women spent several hours talking, sharing stories, laughing occasionally, reflecting on life. At one point, Dorothy reached for Clara's hand. "Thank you." Clara smiled. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." Tears formed in Dorothy's eyes. "You gave me something I thought I had lost." "What?" Dorothy squeezed her hand gently, being seen. Neither woman spoke afterward. Words were unnecessary. A few hours later, Dorothy slipped peacefully away. Clara remained beside her until the very end, holding her hand, exactly as she had promised herself she would. 3 hours later, Michael arrived. 3 hours after 41 days. The timing haunted him immediately, because deep down he understood something. If he had truly wanted to be there, he would have been. People find time for what matters to them. That truth followed him into the funeral, into the attorney's office, into every moment that came afterward. The funeral drew a larger crowd than anyone expected. Former co-workers attended, neighbors attended, church members attended, friends attended. Stories filled the room, story after story, memory after memory, acts of kindness, acts of generosity, acts of compassion. Everyone seemed to have a Dorothy story, because that was the kind of life she had lived. A life that touched people, a life that mattered. Then came the reading of the will. Michael expected a straightforward process. After all, he was her only child. The outcome seemed obvious, until it wasn't. When the attorney began reading Dorothy's final instructions, confusion slowly appeared across Michael's face. Then surprise, then disbelief, then shock. Because the majority of Dorothy's estate had been left to Clara Simmons, the nurse. The young woman who had entered Dorothy's life only weeks earlier. The room fell silent. Michael stared at the attorney, certain there had been a mistake. There wasn't. Every document had been reviewed, every signature verified, every legal requirement satisfied. Then Daniel Foster read Dorothy's final written statement. A statement she had personally prepared, a statement she wanted included. It said, "Family is not defined by who shares your blood. Family is defined by who shares your burdens. During the most difficult chapter of my life, one person showed me kindness every single day. One person stayed. One person cared. One person made sure I never felt invisible. That person was Clara." Several people began crying. Even Daniel struggled to maintain his composure. Michael remained silent. For perhaps the first time in his life, there were no excuses available. No meetings to blame. No deadlines to reference. No schedules to hide behind. Only consequences. The consequences of choices made over many years. Michael challenged the will. The process lasted months. Lawyers became involved, arguments were presented, evidence was reviewed. Yet every attempt failed. Dorothy's wishes remained intact. Eventually, the legal battle ended, and with it, the final opportunity to change the outcome. Years passed. Clara used much of the inheritance to establish a foundation supporting elderly patients without family support. It was exactly the kind of mission Dorothy would have loved. Hundreds of people eventually benefited, perhaps thousands, and Dorothy's story continued spreading, not because of the money, not because of the controversy, but because of the lesson, a lesson that resonated with everyone who heard it. Show up. That's it. Show up, call the people you love, visit them, spend time with them, be present. Because one day there will be no second chance. One day there will be no postponed visit, no delayed phone call, no future opportunity, only memories. And when that day comes, what people remember most is rarely what we said. It's whether we were there. Dorothy spent her life believing family was defined by love. In the end, she discovered something even deeper. Love is not measured by promises. Love is measured by presence, by effort, by action, by showing up when it matters. And perhaps that is why her story continues touching people long after she is gone. Because somewhere, someone is postponing a visit. Someone is delaying a phone call. Someone is assuming there will always be more time. But time is the one thing life never guarantees. So if there is someone you love, reach out. If there is someone you miss, call them. If there is someone waiting to hear your voice, don't wait until tomorrow. Because tomorrow is a promise none of us have. And sometimes the smallest act of presence becomes the greatest gift we ever leave behind. If this story touched your heart, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And remember, the people who matter most in life rarely need perfection. They simply need your presence, and that can make all the difference in the world.